Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, let's just unpack this right away. Because what we are looking at today isn't just a sports story.
Right.
And it certainly isn't just a wrestling story. It's a profound, really layered human interest story. We're looking at a man who spent, the vast majority of his adult life on national television.
Performing in front of millions of people.
Exactly, millions of screaming people. Yet somehow he managed to remain almost entirely hidden. Today, we are diving into the life, the career, and the really intense private struggles of a man known to the world as Iron Mike Sharpe.
And what's truly fascinating here, at least to me, is the absolute dichotomy between the character you saw in the ring and the man who existed back in the locker room.
Oh, absolutely. It's night and day.
It really is. When you go through the massive stack of sources we've gathered for this deep dive, the encyclopedia entries, the historical championship lineages from the old regional territories, and especially the biographical anecdotes.
Memoirs.
Right, the memoirs pulled directly from wrestling legends. Guys like the Dynamite Kid, Hulk Hogan, announcer Gary Michael Capetta, and Gorilla Monsoon. A very complex picture starts to emerge from all of that.
Yeah.
We are looking at a performer whose public persona was just entirely defined by loud, aggressive, chaotic energy. I mean, he was a screaming brute. But his private life was governed by a vulnerable, almost paralyzing need for order and cleanliness.
And that contrast is exactly what we're going to explore with you today. Because if you happen to be a casual fan who, say, watched wrestling on Saturday mornings in the 1980s or 90s, you probably have a very specific memory of Mike Sharpe.
You remember him as a background player.
Exactly. The industry term for it is a jobber. He was the giant screaming guy in the ring whose entire job was to lose. He lost to the rising stars to make them look good.
Right.
But looking through these documents we have, the narrative that he was just a career loser is completely shattered. He carried a massive historic family legacy. He held multiple regional championships. He was widely respected as an absolute master mechanic in the ring.
Yes, he was.
And he did all of this while fighting a severe daily battle with obsessive-compulsive disorder. And he did it in what had to be one of the most chaotic, unhygienic work environments imaginable.
It really forces a complete reevaluation of how we view the supporting cast in any form of entertainment.
Yeah.
I think to truly understand the psychology of Mike Sharpe and to understand why he embraced the specific role he played for so long, we really have to go all the way back to the beginning.
Let's do it.
Because his path into the squared circle was anything but typical, especially when you look at the family tree he was born into.
So walk me through that early landscape. The notes here mention he was born Michael Sharpe on October 28, 1951 in Hamilton, Ontario. But he actually grew up in California.
He did?
And then he eventually moved back to Canada as a teenager. That is a lot of geographical bouncing around for a kid. But the most critical piece of the puzzle seems to be his lineage. His father and his uncle were already in the business, right?
They weren't just in the business, they were royalty. Oh, yeah. His father, Mike Sharpe Sr., and his uncle Ben Sharpe were a massively successful tag team in the 1950s. To give you some context on what that actually means, the 1950s was the golden age of television wrestling.
Because of the post-war boom?
Exactly. The post-war economic boom meant families were buying televisions for the very first time. And professional wrestling was one of the very first programs broadcast just to test the networks. The Sharpe brothers were pioneers of that specific era.
Wow.
They were huge athletic men, and they were recognized as champions everywhere, from the bustling territory of San Francisco all the way over to Japan.
I saw that in the notes, the Japan tours.
Their tours of Japan are legendary. They wrestled Rikidozan, who is essentially the godfather of Japanese professional wrestling, and they did it in front of crowds that brought the entire country to a standstill.
I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of a kid growing up with that shadow over him. Your father and your uncle are quite literally international superstars.
Pioneers of a global industry.
Right. Your last name is practically synonymous with the sport on two different continents. The expectation for you to follow in their footsteps must have been suffocating.
And especially considering his physical size.
Oh, yeah. He eventually grew to be 6 feet 4 inches tall, weighing around 283 pounds. He was built like a tank. With that bloodline and that physique, you would just assume he was practically born in a wrestling ring.
That's the logical assumption.
Yeah.
And I think it's what makes his actual timeline so intriguing. Despite the pedigree, despite the massive physical frame, he didn't rush into the family business. In high school, he focused his energy entirely elsewhere.
On boxing and weightlifting.
Yes. He dabbled heavily in combat sports and lifting, He was clearly drawn to physical exertion, but he actively avoided the specific theater of professional wrestling for a very long time. He didn't actually start training for the ring until he was 25 years old.
25. That is a fascinating detail. Think about that for a second. I want you to think about a time in your own life when you pivoted your path to follow a family expectation or to take up a legacy. But you did it much later than anyone expected.
It's rare.
Very rare. In the sports world, starting a highly physical, specialized career at 25 is incredibly late. Today, you see athletes entering development centers in their early teens. Why the delay? Was it fear of the legacy or something else entirely?
It's a matter of intense psychological speculation. Waiting until 25 suggests a significant period of hesitation. Perhaps he needed to establish his own physical identity first.
That makes sense.
By getting into boxing and competitive weightlifting, he was proving to himself that he was a legitimate athlete on his own terms. Outside the predetermined world his father and uncle dominated, there's also the reality of his underlying mental health, which we will explore deeply later.
The OCD.
Right. Wrestling is a lifestyle of utter chaos. Even as a young man, he might have recognized on some level that the sheer unpredictability of the wrestling circuit clashed with his innate need for structure. Weightlifting, by contrast, is entirely structured.
It's rigid.
Exactly. You control the weight, you control the reps, you control the environment.
You lift the bar, you put it down. It is predictable. But eventually, the gravitational pull of the family business was just too strong. The notes say he was trained by a guy named Dewey Robertson and made his official debut in 1973.
And we should touch on those early geographic shifts, too.
Yeah, bouncing from the industrial grit of Hamilton, Ontario, out to the sun-soaked culture of 1960s California, and then back again. I have to imagine that navigating those wildly different environments as a kid helped shape his ability to adapt, because adaptability ends up being the defining characteristic of his entire professional life.
Completely. The hallmark of a great traveling professional wrestler in that era was the ability to read a room. You had to understand the specific cultural psychology of the audience you were performing for on any given night.
A crowd in Vancouver reacts very differently to violence than a crowd in New Orleans.
Precisely. Experiencing that kind of cultural whiplash as a youth essentially trained him to be a chameleon. And when he finally did enter the business, he utilized that adaptability immediately. Because the man the world remembers as a career loser on WWF television did not start at the bottom.
This is where the story gets really incredible. Before he ever put on the black arm brace, before he ever stepped foot in a WWF ring, Mike Sharpe was a heavily decorated regional powerhouse.
He was a star.
For a solid decade, from 1973 to 1983, he was collecting championships. I'm looking at the data from Gene Kiniski's NWA All-Star Wrestling territory up in Vancouver. He absolutely cleaned up there.
He really did.
He was a two-time NWA Canadian Tag Team Champion, and he won the Pacific Coast Heavyweight title. Can you explain how the territory system worked back then? Because I don't think modern fans understand what a big deal it was to be a champion in Vancouver.
That is vital context. For you listening who only knows the modern, globalized version of sports entertainment, you have to understand that in the 1970s, the wrestling landscape was fractured.
Right.
It was structured almost like a series of distinct mafia families ruling over different geographic regions. The National Wrestling Alliance, the NWA, was the governing body that theoretically kept the peace between all these regional promoters.
So you had a territory in Florida, a territory in Texas, a territory in the Pacific Northwest, and so on.
Exactly. They didn't compete on national television. They just dominated their local markets.
So being the champion of Vancouver meant you were the absolute king of that specific fiefdom.
Precisely. The promoter of that territory, Gene Kiniski in this case, relied on his champion to draw money. If the champion wasn't compelling, the local fans didn't buy tickets to the arena, and the promoter went out of business.
It's a high-stakes game.
Very high stakes. They did not put championship belts on guys who couldn't perform. So for Mike Sharpe to hold the Pacific Coast Heavyweight title meant he was the financial anchor of that entire region.
And we shouldn't gloss over the tag team titles he won there either. He won them with two completely different partners, Moose Morawski and Salvatore Bellomo.
Which is huge.
Right. In the mechanics of the wrestling business, winning tag titles with different partners proves immense versatility. It shows you aren't being hidden or carried by a single established tag team dynamic. It means Mike Sharpe was the common denominator of success.
He was the glue holding those matches together.
But his success wasn't just limited to the Pacific Northwest. He eventually moved down to the American South, working for Mid-South Wrestling in Louisiana. And according to the historical records here, he wasn't just a champion down there. He was a massive fan favorite.
A babyface, as the industry calls it.
Right. He won the Mid-South Louisiana Championship twice, the Mississippi title twice, and then there is this one specific detail that really jumped out at me. In 1979, he won a brass knucks title. What exactly is a brass knucks championship?
The Brass Knuckles Championship is one of the most fascinating artifacts of the territory days. Before the term hardcore wrestling even existed, before the era of chairs and tables and barbed wire, there was the Brass Knucks title.
Sounds violent.
It was a championship specifically designed to be defended in wild, bloody brawls. The matches were billed as unsanctioned street fights.
So it's not about technical holds or pinning someone's shoulders to the mat. It's about surviving a fistfight.
Exactly. And the psychology behind it is crucial. A promoter only gives a brass knucks belt to someone the audience genuinely believes is one of the toughest, most rugged, most dangerous men on the entire roster.
So you have to be believable.
Highly believable. It requires an entirely different style of performance than a traditional wrestling match. It requires throwing incredibly realistic punches, taking immense physical punishment, and usually bleeding heavily to sell the violence of the fight to the crowd.
So now look at the portfolio he's built. We have evidence that Mike Sharpe was a smooth technical champion in Vancouver, a highly adaptable tag team specialist, and a certified blood and guts brawler in the Deep South.
The resume is practically flawless at this point.
And the regional success tour continues into the 1980s. From 1980 to 1981, he heads up to Calgary, Alberta to work for Stampede Wrestling. Now, even casual fans have usually heard of Stampede.
The Hart family.
Exactly. That is the promotion run by the legendary Hart family. Stu Hart, Bret Hart, Owen Hart. It was notorious for being one of the most physically grueling, technically demanding territories in the world.
Without a doubt.
While he was there, he teamed up with Duke Myers and won the Stampede International Tag Team Championship. And if you look at the historical lineages provided in our source material, the names he shares that specific title history with are just staggering.
It is a veritable who's who of wrestling royalty. Stampede Wrestling was famous for the dungeon, the basement where Stu Hart trained wrestlers using painful, legitimate submission holds. To survive in Stampede, you had to be incredibly tough and incredibly precise.
You couldn't fake it there.
Not at all. If you look at the men who held those Stampede tag titles in that era, you see names like the Von Steigers, the Wild Samoans, Mr. Hito, and the legendary Dynamite Kid.
Oh.
The Dynamite Kid is widely considered one of the most innovative, intense, in-ring performers of the 20th century. To be booked to hold the exact same championship as those individuals means the promoters, the notoriously strict Hart family, viewed Mike Sharpe as an elite, top-tier talent. He was a peer to legends.
He was a draw. He was a hero to the fans in Mid-South, a champion in Canada, a respected brawler in the mud shows. He had the pedigree, the size, and the proven track record. But then we hit February of 1983, and this is the pivot point.
This is where everything changes.
Mike Sharpe enters the World Wrestling Federation, the WWF, a company owned by Vince McMahon, which is just on the cusp of launching its massive national expansion. Sharpe enters the WWF, and he ends up staying there for over a decade, until 1995. This is where the character that the world remembers is born.
This is the critical juncture of his entire career trajectory. When he arrives in the WWF, he adopts a new moniker. He starts calling himself Canada's greatest athlete.
Such a great, arrogant villain name.
Now, as a fun piece of trivia, he actually borrowed that nickname from his former boss in Vancouver, Gene Kiniski. But it's not the nickname that makes him famous. It is the physical affectations, the deliberate theatrical choices he makes to build this new character.
Oh, the gimmick is masterful. First of all, there is the auditory element. He is characterized by this near-constant yelling and grunting throughout his matches.
Just endless.
Endless, aggressive, guttural noise echoing through the arena from the exact moment the bell rings. And then there is the visual element, the accessory. He wears a thick, black leather forearm brace on his right arm.
Right.
The storyline explanation was that he was supposedly protecting a lingering injury, but it was widely believed by the audience and heavily implied by the television commentators that the brace actually concealed a heavy-loaded foreign object, like a piece of metal or a roll of quarters.
The brilliance of that gimmick simply cannot be overstated. From a theatrical standpoint, the constant screaming and that mysterious black brace are masterful, simple tools to draw the ire of the crowd.
It's instant.
In wrestling terminology, that negative crowd reaction is called heat. The psychology of the foreign object trope is deeply ingrained in the history of the sport. It is brilliant because it requires absolutely zero exposition.
You don't need a commentator to explain a complex backstory.
Precisely. The moment Mike Sharpe steps through the curtain, wearing a scowl and rubbing that thick black leather brace, even the person sitting in the very last row of the arena instantly understands the narrative.
This man is a villain.
He is a cheater, he has a weapon, and he is a direct threat to the hero of the match. It bypasses logic and hits the audience right in their sense of primal fairness.
It's visual storytelling at its absolute finest. And initially, the WWF really pushed him as a legitimate threat to their top stars. He wasn't brought in to be a loser.
No, not at first.
He was managed by the infamous Captain Lou Albano, who was the premier villainous manager of the era. He was regularly featured on television, destroying lesser opponents by smashing them in the face with that loaded forearm. And this initial monster push culminated on April 30th, 1983.
A huge date.
Mike Sharpe was booked to challenge the world heavyweight champion Bob Backlund at the Philadelphia Spectrum.
We really need to pause and recognize the magnitude of that date. April 30th, 1983 represents the absolute apex of his national career. Main eventing the Philadelphia Spectrum against the world heavyweight champion is as high as the mountain goes in this industry.
It doesn't get bigger.
The Spectrum was one of the most important, raucous buildings in the entire wrestling world. The Philadelphia crowds were notoriously tough. Bob Backlund was the ultimate clean-cut collegiate amateur wrestling hero. Sharpe was the screaming foreign invader with a weapon on his arm. It was a perfect clash of styles. But as history shows, Mike Sharpe lost that match.
And losing that match dictates the rest of his career, doesn't it? Let me ask you this, because this is where the psychology of the business is so strange to outsiders. If he's this incredibly talented guy, a former champion everywhere else, why does losing one match to the world champion suddenly demote him? Why didn't he just climb back up the ranks?
Because of the strict, almost formulaic reality of the wrestling business during a national expansion. When you are brought into a territory specifically to challenge the champion, your entire purpose is to be a credible monster for the hero to vanquish.
Oh, I see.
Once the hero slays the dragon loses its aura of invincibility. Unless you are the absolute top star of the era, your role fundamentally shifts. Sharpe had served his narrative purpose. He proved that Backlund could overcome a massive cheating brute.
And after that, he was shuffled down the cord.
Exactly. He never reached those main event heights in the WWF again. In fact, the sources point out an incredible statistic. Despite his immense talent and his 12-year tenure, Mike Sharpe never held a single championship during his entire run in the WWF.
And so post-1983, we watched the anatomy of a professional jobber begin to take shape. Sharpe transitioned into the guy on the television tapings whose primary job was to lose. Whenever a new muscular hero was signed to the company, Mike Sharpe was the first guy they put him in the ring with. He became the ultimate stepping stone.
If you analyze the structure of any epic narrative, whether it's professional wrestling, a comic book, or a Greek myth, every production needs a reliable antagonist.
Bad guy.
The hero cannot look heroic if the obstacle they are facing is incredible. If Superman only fights bank robbers, Superman doesn't look very impressive. Mike Sharpe, with his massive size, his legitimate family pedigree, his technical skill, and that instantly recognizable black brace, became the perfect, reliable obstacle.
It takes an unbelievable amount of professional respect to be put in that position. I want you to relate this to your own life and your own career for a second. Think about your workplace. Think about the corporate hierarchy. Who are the people in your organization whose primary role is to set others up for success?
The unsung heroes.
The people who do the heavy lifting behind the scenes, ensuring the presentation goes smoothly, training the new hires, stabilizing the chaotic projects, often without getting the glory, the bonus, or the promotion themselves. That was Mike Sharpe in the WWF. It takes immense physical skill to protect your opponent, dictate the pace of the match, ensure nobody gets injured, and make the audience truly believe that the rising star is a world beater.
It also requires a profound, almost superhuman lack of ego. In a business driven entirely by narcissism, vanity, and the spotlight, to willingly go out to the ring night after night, take the physical punishment, stare at the lights, and ensure the other guy looks like $1 million is an incredibly rare trait.
It has to be.
It's why he lasted in the WWF from 1983 all the way to 1995. You do not survive 12 years in the biggest, most ruthlessly competitive wrestling company in the world just by being a warm body. You survive by being absolutely indispensable to the machinery of the show.
And the crazy thing is, even though his television role was always to lose, the guys in the back knew exactly how good he was. The sources note that he actually chalked up quite a few untelevised victories between 1984 and 1988 at the live events, the non-televised shows known as house shows.
Right.
Plus, whenever management had a uniquely delicate or high-profile situation, they called Mike Sharpe. In 1984, he appeared on Piper's Pit, hosted by Roddy Piper, which was the hottest, most unpredictable interview segment on television. In 1987, he was chosen to provide the opposition for Ivan Putski's major comeback match at Madison Square Garden.
That's a huge deal.
And in 1988, he actually reached the second round of the prestigious King of the Ring tournament by pinning Boris Zukov.
Being chosen for Ivan Putski's comeback match at Madison Square Garden is a massive vote of confidence from Vince McMahon and the management team. Putski was an older, highly popular star returning after a long absence. He was likely dealing with ring rust.
He needed to be protected.
Precisely. Management needed someone in the ring with him who was completely safe, who could physically guide the match, take all of Putski's signature offense perfectly, cover up any mistakes, and deliver a performance that would send the notoriously critical New York crowd home happy. You don't put a rookie in that spot. You put your ultimate trusted mechanic in that spot.
Okay, I have to bring up my absolute favorite piece of trivia from this entire stack of research, because it perfectly illustrates how bizarre this industry is. In early 1984, while he is a jobber on American television, Mike Sharpe does a tour of Japan for New Japan Pro Wrestling. And who is his tag team partner over there? Hulk Hogan. But not the Hulk Hogan we know. They are tagging together as heels. Bad guys.
The contradiction there is just staggering. It actually hurts the brain to think about. In early 1984, Hulk Hogan is the ultimate untouchable, vitamin-eating American hero in the United States.
He's a pop culture icon.
He is the face of the WWF's massive national expansion. But the wrestling business is fluid, and geography dictates reality. In Japan, the cultural psychology is entirely different. Hogan was portrayed there as a massive, villainous foreign invader, a Gaijin heel.
Incredible.
So you have Hogan, the biggest star in the world, and Sharpe, the guy losing on Saturday morning television in America, teaming up as equals to terrorize the Japanese fan favorites. It really highlights the illusionary nature of the business. You can be the biggest hero in the world in New York and a hated, rule-breaking villain in Tokyo. And Mike Sharpe was skilled enough and versatile enough to bridge that gap and stand shoulder to shoulder with Hogan.
And his crossover didn't even stop in Japan. During late 1984 and early 1985, he's also taking bookings down in Memphis for the Continental Wrestling Association. And what happens? He wins the NWA Mid-America Heavyweight Championship.
Let's look at the source data on that title lineage.
Yes, this is a championship previously held by Harley Race, Jerry the King Lawler, Buddy Rogers, Tommy Rich, and Randy Savage. Let that sink in. Mike Sharpe, the screaming guy in the black arm brace who always lost on WWF programming, held the exact same piece of gold as Macho Man Randy Savage.
It completely reinforces the point that his jobber status in the WWF was a specific casting choice by a specific director, not a reflection of his actual talent level. Vince McMahon cast him as the antagonist. But in other territories where work rate, toughness, and pure wrestling ability were prioritized differently by the promoters, he was easily slotted right back into the championship picture.
He could do it all.
Even the WWF recognized his versatility. Yeah. The sources mention he actually had a brief run as a fan favorite, a babyface in late 1988, getting televised wins over other notorious jobbers like Steve Lombardi and Barry Horowitz. The crowd loved it because they recognized his underlying talent.
He truly was the king of the jobbers. But now we have to pull back the curtain on the man himself. Because everything we've talked about so far, the shouting, the brawling, the brutal travel schedule, the championships, the black arm brace that was the public-facing Iron Mike, the private reality of Michael Sharpe was vastly, tragically different.
This brings us to the emotional and psychological core of our deep dive. According to multiple memoirs written by his peers, including the Dynamite Kid, Hulk Hogan, announcer Gary Michael Capetta, and the legendary commentator Gorilla Monsoon, Mike Sharpe, exhibited severe, debilitating characteristics of obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD.
In the locker room behind closed doors, he earned a nickname. They called him Mr. Clean. And the details provided in these books are heartbreaking when you really sit down and process them. He wasn't just neat. He was preoccupied with cleanliness to the point where he would spend hours, literally hours, washing his hands or standing in the showers at the arenas.
It's an overwhelming compulsion.
He would meticulously fold, unfold, and refold his clothing over and over again, trapped in a loop, unable to stop until it felt perfectly right.
This raises a vital point about how neurodivergence and severe mental health struggles were viewed in the 1980s, particularly in the hypermasculine world of professional sports. The vocabulary simply didn't exist in that locker room.
No, not at all.
In that incredibly demanding, testosterone-fueled environment, these debilitating compulsions were often brushed off as mere quirks. He wasn't recognized as a man suffering from a recognized treatable mental health condition. He was just given a nickname, Mr. Clean, and treated as an eccentric oddity by his peers.
I want to really paint a picture of what that means. Imagine the pure agony of that existence. Professional wrestling in the 1980s meant an absolutely grueling travel schedule. You were working 300 days a year.
On the road, constantly.
You are in a different city every single night. You were crammed into tiny rental cars with 3 other massive, sweating, bleeding guys. You are wrestling in grimy, unair-conditioned arenas built in the 1920s. You are rolling around on canvas ring mats covered in the sweat, blood, and saliva of 30 other men.
Medical standards and hygiene were an afterthought.
For a man suffering from a severe, compulsive need for cleanliness and order, that environment must have felt like a waking, inescapable nightmare. Every single day of his career was a psychological battle just to exist in that space.
The immense mental strength it must have taken to endure that environment while also performing highly dangerous, physically demanding matches is almost unimaginable. His compulsions were so severe that they directly negatively interfered with his life. The source material highlights a very famous anecdote from a televised house show at the Boston Garden in March of 1986.
The Boston Garden story, this is the one that really encapsulates the tragedy. During the broadcast, Gorilla Monsoon is on commentary, and he jokes to his fellow commentator, Lord Alfred Hayes, about an incident that happened at a previous Boston event. Monsoon casually says on the air that Sharpe had wrestled the very first match of the night.
The opener.
But hours later, when the entire event was completely over, the fans had gone home, the ring crew had packed up, and the building staff locked up the arena for the night. Sharpe was still in the showers. He ended up being locked in and forced to sleep on the floor of the empty Boston Garden.
And we have to look at the context of that. On television, Monsoon played it for laughs. He delivered it like a sitcom punchline. It was just a funny story about wacky Iron Mike taking a long shower. But if we analyze what is actually happening in that building, it underscores the paralyzing severity of his condition. The Boston Garden was a massive, old, drafty, uncomfortable building. He was trapped in the shower by his own mind for hours, unable to leave, unable to break the cycle of washing, to the point where he was completely abandoned by his colleagues and locked in an empty, dark building overnight. That is not a humorous quirk. That is a man being held hostage by his own brain chemistry.
It's devastating. And there is a theory that I've seen wrestling historians float, which connects his OCD directly to his on-screen character. Think about the black leather forearm brace. Yes, it was a great prop for a bad guy to use as a weapon. But from a psychological standpoint, it was a thick, physical barrier between his skin and the sweat and grime of his opponents.
It was armor.
It was armor, and his constant screaming, a release valve for the immense internal pressure he was under. And it wasn't just cleanliness either. The sources note that commentators frequently pointed out his absolute obsession with physical fitness. The running joke backstage was that if Mike Sharpe wasn't in the ring or in the shower, he was lifting weights.
Always working out.
His entire life was a rigid, compulsive routine of maintaining his body and cleaning his body. That was his armor against the chaos of the wrestling world.
You've hit on the psychological core of the issue. His body was the one thing he could exert total, absolute control over. In a business where promoters dictate your wins, your losses, your travel schedule, your pay, and your public perception, his physical fitness and his cleanliness were the domains where his OCD could manifest as absolute control.
Because he couldn't control the booking.
Exactly. He couldn't control if he won or lost to Bob Backlund, but he could control exactly how many times he folded his shirt and exactly how many weights he lifted.
So let's look at the final chapter of his career and his life, because that desperate need for physical control makes what happens next feel incredibly cruel. His last televised match for the WWF was on June 6, 1995. He teamed up with Dwayne Gill, who was another famous jobber of that era, and they lost a tag team match to the Smoking Guns. That was the end of his national television run.
But after leaving the WWF, he didn't just walk away from the business. Wrestling was all he knew. He spent from 1995 to 1997 working the independent circuit. These are smaller shows, often in high school gyms or armories.
In indies.
And even there, he was still wrestling notable names who were also on the downside of their careers. The records show matches against Nikolai Volkov, Virgil, Bam Bam Bigelow, King Kong Bundy. His very last recorded match took place on November 15, 1997, against the legendary George the Animal Steele.
After the final bell rang on his in-ring career, he transitioned it to teaching. He opened Mike Sharpe's School of Pro Wrestling down in New Jersey, and by all accounts, he was an incredibly effective teacher. He trained some very notable talent who went on to have great careers themselves. Guys like Mike Bucci, who became Nova in ECW, Crowbar in WCW, and specifically the Haas brothers, Charlie and Russ Haas.
The transition to teaching makes perfect psychological sense when you view it through the lens of his personality. He was passing on the fundamentals that made him such a safe, reliable, and trusted worker for all those years in the WWF. Right. If you look at the wrestlers he trained, particularly the Haas brothers, they are renowned in the industry for their crisp, technical proficiency, their amateur-style grappling, and above all, their safety in the ring. Mike Sharpe instilled the strict, mechanical rules of the craft into the next generation. A man who needed order in his own life thrived in an environment where he could dictate the order and structure for his students.
But then we get to the health decline, and it is just devastating. In 2007, he moved back to his hometown of Hamilton, Ontario. He moved back to live with and care for his aging mother. During that summer, he was doing some routine landscaping work outside the house and suffered a deep cut to his leg. Now, normally that's just a trip to the clinic for some stitches, but that cut became severely infected.
And here's the tragic irony. For a man whose entire identity, whose entire livelihood, and whose primary psychological coping mechanism was tied to his physical fitness and bodily maintenance, a severe physical infection is a catastrophic blow.
Everything he worked to protect.
Exactly. The infection ravaged his leg and led to profound permanent mobility issues. This giant of a man, this 280-pound powerhouse who spent his life lifting weights to maintain control, began using a wheelchair.
He ended up living in a basement apartment in Hamilton, and according to the sources, he became a complete recluse. Other health problems, likely exacerbated by his immobility and isolation, compounded over the years. A man who spent his life performing for millions of screaming fans, traveling the globe, sharing the ring with icons like Hulk Hogan and Bob Backlund, was now physically trapped in a basement, isolated from the world.
It forces us to reflect on a very uncomfortable reality about the sports and entertainment industries. How does the industry take care of its veterans? Here's a man who spent decades sacrificing his body to make others look like superstars.
He built a foundation.
He took the bumps. He absorbed the impacts. He was the foundational machinery that allowed a billion-dollar industry to function and expand globally. Yet, in his twilight years, battling severe physical decline and lifelong mental health issues, he's entirely hidden away, largely forgotten by the machine he helped build.
It wasn't until 2015 that he finally allowed a video camera to record him, and that was solely because he wanted to participate in a video tribute to another Hamilton wrestling legend, Angelo Mosca Sr. That brief, grainy video was his final public appearance. Iron Mike Sharpe passed away on January 17, 2016, in Hamilton at the age of 64.
It's a deeply somber conclusion to a life that was lived so loudly, so aggressively in public, yet so quietly and painfully in reality.
So what does this all mean for us? We have a man who was literally born into wrestling royalty, carrying the weight of a legendary 1950s tag team on his back, a man who won championships all over North America, surviving bloody brass knucks brawls in the grueling Stampede dungeon.
An incredible resume.
A man who created one of the most recognizable, iconic villain personas of the 1980s just by grunting and wearing a black arm brace. He gave his body to entertain millions. He patiently trained the next generation of athletes, but he spent his entire career fighting a quiet, intense, debilitating battle with severe OCD, and spent his final years completely hidden away from the world he helped build.
His legacy is incredibly complex and deserves profound respect. Mike Sharpe was not just a guy who lost on Saturday mornings. He was a master craftsman. He was a survivor in an unforgiving, chaotic era of sports entertainment. And his story demands that we reevaluate how we remember the supporting casts in any era of history, recognizing the invisible burdens they may have carried.
And that leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to ponder today as you go about your week. The next time you watch a movie or a sporting event, or even just look around at the hierarchy of your own company or community, look past the main eventers.
Look past the stars.
Look past the stars whose names are on the marquee. Take a moment to look at the jobbers, the people doing the heavy, unglamorous lifting day in and day out just to keep the machinery moving, to make the leaders look good. What hidden battles might they be fighting? What unseen legacies do they carry? Because as we've learned today with Iron Mike, sometimes the most fascinating, most heroic story in the room isn't the one holding the championship trophy. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the life of Mike Sharpe.
It's been a privilege to unpack this history and explore this remarkable life. Remember to always look a little closer at the background. Until next time.